Hello there, and welcome back to the Level 2 lessons for the Star Wars Unlimited Judge Program. As always, I'm your host Jonah, and this lesson is going to be taking a deeper look at the card manipulation error policy. This includes any errors where players see the faces of cards that they shouldn't, whether by misresolving game abilities or dexterity errors. This is a very tricky corner of policy because, by its very nature, it involves hidden information, and consequently can be difficult or impossible for the opponent to verify knowledge, which can make remedying the errors very challenging. As always with policy, this is an area that is continually being refined and will grow and evolve as play also continues to evolve. This does make it a bit of a challenge to both learn and teach, so this is likely a lesson that will similarly evolve over time. Now, with any card manipulation error, there are two key components about how you handle the situation. The first is determining which cards a player incorrectly manipulated. Manipulation in this case can refer to a variety of things. A player drawing an extra card and adding it to their hand. Card sleeves sticking together and an extra card is added to the resource row while resolving a smuggle ability. A player accidentally drops a card from their opponent's deck while shuffling it. A player looks at the top card of their deck while R2-D2 ignoring protocol is defeated because they erroneously believe it is a when defeated ability, not an on attack when played. Maybe a player knocks the top card of their deck off while drawing for turn, revealing it to both players. There are many other situations where cards can accidentally move between hidden zones or be looked at when they should remain hidden. Sometimes it'll be easy to identify what card is the problematic one. For dexterity errors, you'll frequently see a single face-up card, or a card that both players can point to and say, that doesn't belong there. However, sometimes even a dexterity error can result in less clarity. For example, if a card is face down and among poorly organized resources. If the opponent of the player can clearly identify which card is the problematic card, we can use that information in the fix. An example of this happening is a player attacking with R2-D2 full of solutions and picking up the top card of their deck and then calling for a judge and saying that they thought it was R2-D2, ignoring protocol, and were resolving the on-attack ability. The card that they have accessed has not been mingled with any other zone, and while the active player is the only one who's seen the face of the card and can confirm any attributes of it, the non-active player can still confirm that it's the same physical card. Similarly, there will be some cases where a card is flipped over where the opponent can easily and clearly identify a specific card as the erroneous card. However, once the active player has manipulated the erroneous card into a set of other hidden cards, it becomes much more difficult to remedy. For example, if an extra card is accidentally added to the resources, and it's clear that the player has not manipulated the card because it's sitting at an angle and every other card is readied, we can work with that card. However, as soon as the player begins to manipulate the cards, as soon as they move them around, even if they're trying to clarify the situation to their opponent, if the cards remain hidden, it becomes much more probable that the opponent can no longer identify the erroneous card specifically. Similarly, if a card gets shuffled into the deck or added to the hand while the player is holding those cards, it can be difficult for the opponent to confirm the identity of the card, because the player could very easily move cards around, even unintentionally. A lot of players just naturally shift cards around, and sometimes they don't add cards to the front or back of their hand, it just slides into the middle portion. It's important to ask the opponent if they are able to identify the card that needs to be addressed. We don't ask the player who committed the error because, while we don't assume that the player is malicious, allowing them to make that decision would make it so that the error can result in significant advantage for malicious players. Mitigating that advantage disincentivizes malicious players and makes it so that a player isn't incentivized to make errors, generally speaking. Now, if you're unable to identify specifically which card or cards are the ones that must be remedied easily, there are a few more steps we can take. First, we can ask to see both players' notes. If a player played a card like Spark of Rebellion and wrote down their opponent's hand, we can use that information to preserve some of the cards that are still in the player's hands, as we can know what cards are supposed to be there. However, when utilizing this information, it's important to account for the fact that players are allowed to resource cards, and that information is private. For example, if the opponent says, I know they have an Alliance X-Wing and a Battlefield Marine in hand, and you indicate that only one card can be preserved, that gives the opponent information that they didn't necessarily have. Now they know that one of those two cards has been resourced. However, A minor advantage for the player who did not commit the error is an acceptable outcome of the remedy, as long as it results in a more natural fix, and keeping cards that are supposed to be in the player's hand where they're supposed to be is a more natural fix. However, even ruling out cards this way, there's still a likely chance that they're unknown cards, and it's important to remove the excess cards and return them to the proper zone. There are two ways to determine which is the excess card. The first is randomly. Simply have the player lay out the affected zone face down on the table, and have the opponent select card random. We don't have the judge select the card because that can lead to accusations of bias or favoritism. The downside of the fix is that it doesn't always negate the advantage. For example, if the player should have 4 cards in hand but now has 5, taking a card at random only has a 20% chance of selecting the erroneous card. If the player needed that specific card to win or take a significant advantage, it's very possible that the outcome of the game changes because of this remedy, which is something that we generally want to avoid. The other approach is a little bit more complex. After explaining the fix to both players, have the player lay the affected zone face up on the table, and have the opponent select a card by strategic choice. This method removes the card that the most invested player, the opponent, believes is the most impactful. This has the upside of mitigating any potential advantage the player could have gained from accessing the card. The opponents will pick the best card in the player's hand to remove. If the player needed that one specific card to win and just drew that card, well, they definitely won't be gaining advantage after this fix because their opponent will pick that one. However, if the player authentically and legally had that card, but had been waiting to play it until they had enough resources or for better strategic timing, this fix can result in a very non-organic outcome, which is also something that we want to avoid. While this fix isn't laid out in policy, currently it has been a verified clarification for some time now, and is an option in our tool belt. Now, if the player was the one who identified the issue and it's their first time committing the infraction, I would recommend the former selection process, the random choice. We want to give the players some grace, but we don't want to create scenarios where the fix doesn't actually address the advantage gained. If it's not the first time, or if the opponent is the one who caught the error, I would recommend the second, more complex process, as it mitigates more advantage, and if a player is repeating errors, we start to have a little bit of concern, and we want to make sure that they're not gaining advantage through these errors. However, more important than these recommendations is remaining consistent with your event. If you, as head judge, or your head judge requests a specific approach to fixing these issues, or if you're running the event, pick an approach and stick to it. That way, players know what to expect as a result of their errors and their opponents. Now, once you have identified the erroneous card, whether it was a simple process where there's certainty which card was manipulated, or there's uncertainty in a more complex process, we need to fix the issue. If the error involved a card erroneously leaving the hand, the fix is simple. Return that card to the player's hand, and then proceed. If the error involved a card leaving the resource zone, you must construct how many resources were ready and exhausted. Check with both players about what cards were played this round and which abilities were activated. Because players can freely swap which resources are ready and which are exhausted, as long as they keep the total quantities accurate, you don't need to have the status of a specific card accurate, just the counts. Once you have that information, return the card to the resource zone in the correct state. Now, the deck gets a little bit hairy. If the error involved a card leaving the deck, you must reconstruct which cards were known within the deck. For example, if a player had resolved Darth Vader commanding the First Legion once and put 8 cards on the bottom of the deck, those cards are in a known location. While the specific order within those 8 cards should be random, it's important to preserve those 8 cards on the bottom of the deck. Similarly, if the card was a known card from the top of the deck, for example, because the player had resolved R2-D2 ignoring protocol, that card is preserved. If the card was known, return it to that location. If the card was unknown, it is shuffled into the unknown portion of the deck. Asking players if they know the location of any cards in their deck is key to these remedies. Take a moment to go through each player's in-play cards and discard piles, and ask how relevant abilities were resolved. This can sometimes get tricky. If a player is playing Yoda, sensing darkness, and are unsure how many times they've activated his ability, or how many times they've put a card on the bottom of their deck, do your best to work with them through previous turns to reconstruct the information as best you can. You can also ask the opponent to step away from the table so that the player can talk about their strategic decisions more freely. They might be able to say, last turn I needed a takedown, so I definitely activated Yoda. The card was garbage, so I just put it on the bottom immediately. And that's not something that they would want to say in front of their opponent because it's strategic information, but it does help you resolve this situation. However, even after going through all the cards in discard, all the cards in play, and saying, okay, how do we resolve this? How do we resolve this? Okay, we're looking at a total of 12 cards that we know on the bottom of the deck. You're not always going to have full and perfect information about the order of the deck, and that's okay. This is where your judgment comes in again. If the deck still has a lot of cards in it, and shuffling a card that should be on the bottom of the deck into the rest of the deck is probably more disruptive than leaving one random card near the bottom of the deck. However, if the unknown portion of the deck is very small, fewer than 5 cards, 4 cards, leaving a card that should be randomized can be relatively disruptive. However, both of these disruptions in either case are very minor, and being off by 1 or 2 cards isn't significant. Now, players adding cards to their hands or resources, or taking cards from their resources that they'd played early in the game, can result in significant advantage. It is always important to investigate players when you have potential concern, and card manipulation errors area where we might have a lot of concern. These investigations should occur even if the player called the error on themselves. Of course, we're going to talk about investigations in depth in future lessons, but you can quickly look at the cards that a player has accessed or have in their hand now. If they have multiple answers in their hand, the likelihood of malicious behavior drops dramatically. They already had an out before the error, so why take the risk of making a mistake and having a penalty? With these errors, particularly when cards are being revealed, you also want to take the remedy in multiple steps. You want to explain the process to players, but not have them take action. If they start to shuffle cards into a deck or reveal cards to their opponent and then realize that they want to appeal you or that they misunderstood you, it's very hard to undo those things. Then, after you've explained the process to both players and gotten their acknowledgement, go over it one more time and have them perform the fix at the same time. They should be the ones manipulating the cards, not you, but it's important to stick around to make sure that they do it properly, and you can catch them if they're about to go off the rails. Card manipulation error does come with a warning, but it's nothing to worry about unless players make a habit out of it. Now, with our next lesson, we'll be stepping out of gameplay errors, which are errors based on the comprehensive rules, and switch to tournament disruptions, which are errors based on tournament regulations. We'll be starting with deck and deck list policies, errors and remedies, and following it up in the next lesson covering how to handle deck checks and marked cards. If you're watching this on YouTube and you want more Level 2 lessons in your feed, go ahead and subscribe. Join us generally Tuesdays and Fridays on twitch.tv/SWU_judges for live broadcasts covering the content of these lessons as they're released. Join the Star Wars Unlimited Judge Program Discord to join the community and discussion of this and much, much more. As always, good luck and have fun.